So, during the summer of 2023, I had the rare chance to enroll in the Center for American Archaeology's High School Field School, where I had the opportunity to help excavate a late woodland habitation site in Illinois and get some real hands-on archaeological field experience. If that doesn't make any sense to you though, that's perfectly fine, because I basically dug in the dirt every day in the middle of nowhere for 4 weeks straight and made about as much of a contribution to the field of archaeology as discovering this piece of dirt did. But jokes aside, for my fellow aspiring archaeologists, being given the opportunity to accumulate some field experience before actually getting to college is invaluable. This is simply because most of the time in college, in order to get field experience, you need to have a professor who already has a dig project somewhere and is willing to take you with them. Of course, this is easier said than done. There's a very big difference between studying archaeology and actually getting the hands-on field experience necessary to succeed. Hence, the field school that I attended, which allowed me in high school to get about 4 weeks of experience under the supervision of real archaeologists, but also instruction on how all of this actually works. What are the steps? What are the processes? What are the procedures? Everything that you'd need in order to essentially start your own dig site somewhere else in the world. Except for one tiny little detail, and that is, of course, how do we actually date the things that we find, right? Because the entire point of archaeology, besides expanding our own personal understanding, is to try to contribute to the timeline of world history, while either directly through supportive evidence to the written record, or either indirectly by extending the timeline of world history through the archaeological record. Now, to start, there are two main methodologies in archaeology when it comes to dating things. One relative and the other absolute. Starting with relative dating, archaeologists rely on an artifact's context or its environment when it was first excavated in order to establish causal relationships to its surroundings and in order to fix a chronology. This just means that archaeologists will rely on an artifact's physical relationship to other artifacts, like the distances between them, the differing layers of the Earth's crust they're found in, or their differing designs in order to roughly date each other. And one of the main ways that early archaeologists, as well as many modern archaeologists still do this, is through a method called stratigraphy. Stratigraphy is simply the study of rock layers, or strata, and the process of their layering over a period of time, or stratification. When Nicholas Steno first established stratigraphy in 1669, he proposed 3 general laws that would govern how archaeologists analyze strata and stratification. Of course, though, only one of these is really important to archaeologists, with this being the law of superposition. Simply put, the law of superposition states that in a sequence of uninterrupted strata, the layers present at the bottom are going to be older than the layers present at the top. Therefore, if an artifact were to be discovered at the top of an uninterrupted sequence, like it would in an archaeological excavation, then this specific artifact is going to be younger than any other artifacts discovered potentially below it. Hence the relative dating. We are using the relative position of these two artifacts in order to date one another. The artifact at the top of that sequence had to have been younger than the artifact below it by law of superposition. And hence the inherent issues of relative dating methods. They can only give us a rough estimate of how old things are if, and only if, they have other things to compare them to. This is in stark contrast, though, to absolute dating methods, which instead rely on the inherent physical and chemical properties of artifacts or samples that archaeologists find to date themselves. And one of the main forms of absolute dating, which I also think you'll come to find is in fact the quintessential dating method, if not of absolute dating, then of all of archaeology, is radiometric dating, or as you probably know it as, radiocarbon dating. Radiocarbon dating was first devised in the 1940s by a man named Dr. Willard Libby, and allowed archaeologists to analyze the inherent properties of carbon in order to date things. But what exactly was it that Dr. Libby discovered that so-called revolutionized archaeology's methods of dating? Well, In nature, there are three main types of carbon atoms called isotopes that are plentiful in the Earth's atmosphere. These are carbon isotopes 12, 13, and 14, respectively. Carbon isotopes 12 and 13 possess a stable amount of neutrons, being 6 to 7, and make up 99% and 1% of the atmosphere's carbon. Whereas carbon-14, which is unique in its own way because it possesses only less than 1% of the atmosphere's carbon, and is specifically created when cosmic rays from the sun impact nitrogen in our atmosphere, causing an abnormal amount of neutrons, in this case being 8, creating carbon-14. Carbon-14's instability means that as time passes, it eventually decays into a more stable element like nitrogen. Carbon-14 has a half-life of roughly 5,730 years, meaning that if you were to have a sample of 10 carbon-14 isotopes, then it would take roughly that amount of time for there to only be 5 isotopes left over. It is this process that is crucial to archaeologists, as carbon-14 is still able to participate in the carbon cycle, meaning that plants are able to use carbon-14 for photosynthesis, and subsequent animals who eat these plants are able to retain carbon-14 in their bodies. When organic samples, like wood, are harvested in the past for whatever reason, they become a perfect snapshot of the ratio of stable to unstable carbon isotopes, as these carbon atoms are no longer able to participate in the carbon cycle. Meaning that once an archaeologist, either in the near or distant future, uncovers this sample, they can have it radiocarbon dated. And part of this process involves having the ratio of stable carbon isotopes, 12 and 13, compared to that of unstable carbon-14. Once this comparison has been made, the amount of carbon-14 present in the sample can then be compared to the amount of carbon-14 present in the atmosphere, allowing archaeologists to see how much carbon-14 had fizzled out into nitrogen, and therefore allowing archaeologists to guess or estimate how old this specific sample possibly could be. But one of the major concerns that was acknowledged shortly after Dr. Libby made his contribution was for the potential of carbon variance, right? And that is why absolute dating methods exist. Because absolute dating in and of itself allows archaeologists to rely on the inherent properties of, in this case, carbon to date each other, and don't rely on other artifacts as they would have in stratigraphy. But the issue of carbon variance still remained. After all, it would be pretty disingenuous as to claim that the ratio of carbon isotopes in the 1940s and 50s were the same 3,000 years ago during the Bronze Age. And of course, a more contemporary invention to Dr. Libby's time compounded this fact by artificially increasing the amount of carbon-14 isotopes found in the atmosphere. With this invention, of course, being the advent of nuclear weaponry, because as it turns out, absolutely bombarding Pacific Islands with nuclear test after nuclear test after nuclear test would have unintended consequences on the atmosphere. So, archaeologists brought in the field of dendrochronology, or the study of tree rings and their impact on establishing timelines in order to solve the question of carbon variance. And while dendrochronology in and of itself is an incredibly complex field, archaeologists mainly latched onto two main topics. The first being that as a tree grows out away from its center, it does so in the form of rings. Each ring corresponds to one growth season, or a period of summer and winter, and roughly equates to 1 year of growing. This is how dendrochronologists are able to date how old trees are. All they have to do is simply count how many rings are present in a tree, and roughly speaking, that's how many years old that specific tree is. A side effect of this process, though, is that as trees grow, they require carbon. In this case, important to archaeologists is the amount of carbon-14. But once that tree ring stops growing, in order for a new tree ring to start growing, that older tree ring ends up containing a perfect snapshot of the ratio of carbon isotopes present within it. And thus, when we compile all these tree rings from this specific tree, we essentially get a perfect timeline of the carbon isotope ratios present throughout the entire tree's life. The second concept that archaeologists utilized in order to answer the question of carbon variance is the concept of cross-dating, which, simply put, is the process of acquiring all of this tree ring data and then visualizing it as incremental steps. What dendrochronologists, and in turn archaeologists, look for in this case are matching growth patterns, which allow them to extend the timeline of what would have been one tree's life of carbon variance to several trees' lives, allowing them to extend it really indefinitely, but so far to about 6,000 years into the past. It is archaeology's way of combining seemingly unrelated fields in science to form a complete and comprehensive field under history that allowed archaeologists to answer the question of how they date things, but also in order to provide more to the field of history. Thank you, and God bless.